And one. Well, hey, Dave Melinda here, Positive Polarity Podcast. Hope things are going awesome for you this week. We got a tough topic this week. It's one that we all encounter, but nobody wants to talk about. So, my question for the week is, when was the last time you were in a conflict? And maybe you're in one right now. Maybe you've just got in out of one, or maybe you're about to go into one. So I found an awesome doctor that is going to help us today with this. Dr. Judy Morely, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks, Dave.
Awesome. You are the owner and founder of You Do You Coaching. So fill us in on what is You Do You Coaching?
So I specialize in helping people through change and transitions. And what I found in my time of doing this is that frequently change and transitions,
Tough ones.
yeah, come with conflict. They're either
Yes.
started by a conflict or the change itself creates a conflict. And so I got very interested in how do you navigate that because nothing grows without change. And so you do you coaching is all about being our better selves, but you got to walk through some of the mucky stuff as well.
Sure, and that's awesome. We do some conflict resolution stuff here on our side, and it's interesting when I'm in a group, Judy, and we're talking about it. I kind of ask at the beginning, like, what are some words that you think of when you think of conflict? And I don't know about you, but the people that I run into, like 99 times out of 100, are all negative words.
Hmm.
But yet, conflict can be very positive. It can be constructive. So, kind of start from just the beginning, if you would. I know it seems really basic, but how do you define conflict just for the audience?
Yeah, well, you know, uh, I define conflict as anything that feels oppositional. So anything
Okay.
that feels like there's energetic pressure against. Frequently, when I speak in public, I have my audiences turn to the person next to them and they each put up a hand and they press against each other's hand. And that energy of pressing against the hand is what conflict feels like you're pushing
Sure.
against something. And then I always tell the person on the right to drop their hand. And of course, the person on the left, their hand goes, flies forward.
Sure.
Because when we stop resisting, the conflict goes away.
Okay.
So what I find is that conflict is generally rooted in a fear of something we don't want. It's rooted in a fear that something bad will happen. However we define bad, I know that's a very generic, nondescript term, but
Sure.
it's different in every situation. It could be everything from, you know, uh, the end of a relationship or losing a job or spending money we don't have on something or whatever the bad as we define it is,
Yeah.
and that triggers some sort of fear in us, and that's basically when we begin to resist whatever comes next because of that fear.
Hmm. So conflict then, can it be good or bad? I mean, am I on the right
Oh yeah,
track from that perspective?
absolutely. No, conflict is fertile. It's when we're doing something new. We're trying to do something new. In the classic leadership book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, one of the five dysfunctions is a lack of conflict. So he definitely defines conflict as
Sure.
good. It's fertile. It's where creativity happens. It's where new ideas come from. I think the problem is we aren't taught how to handle conflict. And
Right.
so it triggers something in us. One of the things I like to say about conflict is conflict, and this is a biggie, it's never, ever, 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 ever about the other person.
Right.
It's
Well, we
always,
make it about them, right? It's so
yes.
easy to make it about somebody else.
Yeah, it's always, or the situation or whatever. It's
Yep.
always about us and whatever we are resisting. We're basically resisting the newness that's trying to come through. We're resisting the good, the very thing we say we want. Sometimes I'm going to modify that. Almost always, to get the good we want, we have to let go of something we've already got. In order to grow, you've got to let go of something. And it's in that letting go that the fear comes up and we start to resist. And that's then when the conflict comes up in that resistance, whether it's a
Sure.
person or a situation.
Well, and I think I just kind of as sitting here listening to you, Judy, I'm thinking about blind spot that I have, that I always think conflict has to be between two people, when in reality I can have conflict within myself. So it's really kind of, I don't want to sound weird, but it's almost like two ideologies. I want this, but yet I do that, or so do you notice people working conflict within themselves as well?
Oh, absolutely. My whole family teases me because whenever they ask me something that I'm conflicted about, I buy time to think by saying, I'm of two minds on that. And so
Yeah,
that's kind of the joke my family has there. Now they'll ask me something, and if I don't answer right away, they'll say, are you of two minds on this? Yes, because I'm conflicted in myself. But we grow up with a whole bunch of ideologies. I liked your word very much, ideologies. Things that they come from the environment in which we grew up. They come from our family of origin. They come from authority figures. Sometimes they just come from our culture. But we have these things we believe. And then as we grow up, we are introduced to new things and
yeah,
we want to believe them. They seem right, they kind of resonate with us, but in some ways, they may contradict the beliefs we got growing up. That's almost always where the resistance comes in.
sure.
I'll use an example for me of being conflicted in myself. I grew up in a very, let's call it left brained family. They were filled with bookkeepers and accounting people, and
Sure.
I'm not that. I'm
Yeah.
not that. I'm a
Yeah.
very right-brained creative person. So I heard that the only way you can ever make money is to go get a job as a teacher, school teacher, bookkeeper, secretary, something, something, something like that. That was the
Right.
belief. But so I did that for a little while, but it didn't feel right to me. So when I tried to go out and get into a field that was more creative, I had conflict within myself.
Hmm. Wow. Well, and yeah, we do a lot of work with DISC and the personalities, and there's a lot of people that are people, and then there's people that are fact people. So sounds
I'm
like
a
you grew up in a fact people world and you were a people person, and
I'm a
those can,
95% I on the
there you
disc.
go. So those can be, yeah, you and me both, right? So you can totally have, there's where conflict, whether it's at home, whether it's in the workplace, but I feel like that's almost where conflict starts, when there is a difference. I don't want to say a difference of opinion, but it's really a difference, a different viewpoint, because your family was all about facts and figures and spreadsheets and processes and stuff like that. And for you and I, there's like a negative connotation. I don't know about you, but I can't stand the word process,
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
think of all these things. So it puts me in immediate, like, not in a conflict against that person that said it, but just there's like a wall that's built when I hear process.
yeah.
So, but I think, for people listening, it's starting with your internal, like there's a great book called People Over Profit. It talks about how, treating your people on your team right is actually, more profitable than not. But that seems like a conflict there. So how do you help somebody if somebody comes to you and they have that inner struggle? Where do you start with that in that situation?
So I'm a certified emotional intelligence trainer. So the first thing we do is we start building habits around self-awareness and what you're feeling.
Okay.
Human beings in general, I was about to say Americans, but I think probably human beings in general or are horrific at knowing what we're feeling in the moment. We just aren't taught to identify our feelings. As a matter of fact, we are frequently taught the opposite. We are frequently taught to disidentify with our feelings. When we're kids and we're sad and an authority figure says, "Oh, you have nothing to cry about," or "Why are you mad? You shouldn't be mad about that." We are taught
Right.
to disidentify.
Yeah.
And what that does is that we become kind of numbed out. But emotions never go away. If scientists have shown that emotions are energy, and Einstein proved that energy can't be created or destroyed. So if we've got this energy built up, it's got to express at some point, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we pretend we're not upset at work, say we have a boss that has done something that feels really egregious or invalidating, we don't want to start a conflict. So we pretend everything's okay. But if that happens enough times, that anger, resentment, invalidation, whatever the emotion is going to come out in an inappropriate way. Whether you yell at your boss, whether you do something, insubordinate, or all the way up to something like embezzlement because you feel like you deserve it because they
Sure.
aren't validating you.
Right.
It's because you haven't identified what's going on with you first. So that's always where I start. We start doing exercises on self awareness and emotional intelligence, not only self awareness, but then self management. It's not about not feeling your emotions, it's about feeling them fully, but managing them wisely.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the first place I start with conflict. And then we start talking about the other people.
Sure. Well, can we skip that first part, Judy, and just start talking about other people right away? Isn't that where most people want to,
Yeah,
go and say, hey, this person did that, and blame people? Is that a pretty normal response?
it is absolutely the only response I ever get. People come to me, they say, I'm actually working with a client right now, and I was hired to do some training with a team. And the owner of the business didn't want to be involved because she wanted the team to be able to express freely. But I'll
Yeah.
tell you, I talked to the owner and the problems of the team, and I talked to the team and the problems of the owner.
Yeah.
It's
Right. Yeah.
no, it's not. So yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, that's the most common response. But that's the paradigm shift that has to happen. Is this responsibility for our own emotions and our own part of the conflict? You can't fight with yourself.
Yeah. Well, and don't you think, Judy, that leaders have to hire expect? I think that they have to take the responsibility. They have to take the start. They have to take the leap. If you have team blaming the owner, so to speak, owner blaming the team, I mean, that's a stalemate. So really, you can try to get the team to move off dead center, but I feel like a owner, a leader really has the higher call, the higher responsibility to take that first spot. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Absolutely. And that's why my book on conflict talks to leaders, really, because it's their responsibility. Well, yeah, it's their responsibility to ultimately create the environment to fix it. They can't fix it.
Yeah.
Each individual has to do their own work,
Right.
but they
Yep.
have to create the environment to fix it.
Yeah. Well, because I mean, I think if a leader starts off by saying, I messed this up or I need help in this area, I mean, the team's wall just naturally comes
Yes.
down and it just seems so much easier for the team to become vulnerable. I mean, vulnerability seems to be becoming more and more prevalent in leadership development. And it's one of those things that a lot of people struggle with. I just feel like the more vulnerable you are, the more vulnerable your team's going to be. And then, quite frankly, the more vulnerable your customer is. And it just, everybody can be themselves and be
Yeah.
real rather than walking around with these fake personas. So I just love that.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I think that the vulnerability, though, has to come, it has to be built on, it's kind of a paradox. It has to be built on a good sense of self-confidence. You can't build vulnerability on a platform of profound insecurity as a
Yeah.
leader. You
Yeah.
have to know that you're really good at what you do and you're a really great leader and you have the best interests of your team and your organization at heart, and you make mistakes sometimes and you're
Yeah.
able to admit that. But if you walk around as a leader with this chronic insecurity and this feeling that I'm never enough and some level of imposter syndrome, or I can't do this, or oh my gosh, I don't want people to find out about me, or whatever
Yeah.
that is, then you
Yeah.
can't be vulnerable. And that's where the conflict comes. And that's where so many leaders are. They refuse to be vulnerable because they're dealing with that insecurity in themselves.
Sure. Wow. Well, and it's interesting because I think it actually does tie into our personality because you on your website talked about some of the personal struggles that you had personally in your life, physically and relationally. Um, you would not really see a C person, an engineer, that fact person. They're not generally going to be leading with that type of information because there's a pretty strong line between personal and professional for certain personalities. So if you're listening and it's really like foreign to you, it's okay because you're kind of built that way. It doesn't give you the fact of that you're the get out of jail free card that you never have to do it. But the reality is, I think, and I wanted your opinion on this, Judy, it seems harder for certain personalities and people with the lower the EQ, the less likely that they're actually going to be able to own some of that stuff. And I'm just curious what your research has shown.
Yeah, I agree with you. Certain personalities are prone to be more self-aware, but they found with EQ that it's a skill. It's
Yeah,
a skill that anyone can learn, unlike IQ, which you're born with. You're born with your IQ, doesn't really change through your lifetime, even if you test differently. Your EQ is a skill. And I would think for the C and the S people, learning a new skill would appeal to them, because
sure.
there is a process that you go through. So
Right.
it's identifying what skills you might be needing to brush up on,
Yeah.
and then learning them. But I agree with you. Part of the steps in my book on master conflict, it's geared toward women leaders in particular, but lots of people. I've had plenty of men write me. They've read it. The title is Master Conflict Without Being a Bitch.
Yeah.
So, but the steps I go through, I recognize that I'm talking to people like you and me who are high people,
Yep.
and I'm talking to the S's and the C's um, as well
Sure.
that want more of a process. So I have 5 steps in
Okay.
my book.
Awesome.
And one of the steps, the second of them, is to set clear expectations, which I know from growing up in a very C household
Yeah.
is great. It's
Yep.
crucial. Setting those expectations are really awesome because then there's a metric that you can measure toward and there's data involved.
Right.
And I think it's also important for I's and some of the D's like you and I, because we tend to go too far the other way. Like, oh, we all know
Right.
Joe, he's a good
Yep.
guy. We're just going to let him off the hook this time.
Yep. Yep.
But when you have a metric and data, then you can be kind and empathetic and understanding and still hold people accountable because it takes the personalities out of it.
Sure. Sure. That's a hard balance to walk, I'm guessing, especially I want to kind of, before we jump into a break, I want to just begin to talk about this transition piece because you mentioned transition. So that could be buying or selling a business, that could be getting a demotion, a promotion, that could be a new job. There's a variety of different things that are in this transition, bucket, so to speak. So our transition and conflict, I mean, they're different, but yet how do they kind of work together with each other?
So change is an event, transition is a process.
Okay.
So a change happens, and that's the end of an old way of being. And now the transition starts.
Gotcha.
And so sometimes in that transition phase, as new things are being introduced, that's where there's an opportunity for conflict if you haven't fully come to grips with the idea of the change. If you haven't fully let go of what went before, and anything new starts to
Yeah.
feel in conflict.
So I hear people, and I've even said it, let's just agree to disagree type thing. I mean, that doesn't feel like the ideal conflict resolution, but it feels like it's smoothing it over. I mean, is that really a good way for people? Because I'm guessing people listening around the world on this one, Judy, have said, let's just agree to disagree. Is
Sure.
that a healthy spot to be?
It really depends on the context. I think as we've seen in the United States in the last 8 years, it's difficult to agree to disagree.
Yeah.
Um, that does take a level of maturity to still respect the other person. I would say if it's your spouse and you have a major disagreement about finances or raising children or where you want to live, agreeing to disagree is not a healthy place to
Sure.
be.
Great point.
If you're part of a team and you both believe in the end goal and you both have strong ideas on how to get there and you're willing to discuss them, then agreeing to disagree is healthy because
Sure.
in the discussion, you're going to find a way that you both agree on to get to the common goal. So I think it completely depends on the context.
Gotcha. Which then I would assume then the cousin of agree to disagree is kind of compromise. So where people are trying to find that middle ground. But I mean, if you walk into I'm just curious if I'm not really on board with the compromise, it's got to really kind of not go well, I'm guessing, right?
Correct. Correct. Because you're going to undermine it always. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So my answer, and I know we're heading to a break, so I don't want to go too long, but my answer to that is you always have to go back to vision. You
Okay.
need to have people on board who share your vision. Because what happens if you don't have a vision and you decide to do a project without a higher vision, then you have my way and your way,
Yeah.
and they're in opposition. But if you have the higher vision, then you have you and me together going toward the vision, and we
Sure.
have just a whole bunch of ideas about how to get there. And so the vision becomes the destination, and it takes the tug of war of your way and my way out of the conversation. But you're right, compromise can just lead to undermining. So, what I say about compromise, if you're going for a common vision and you and I disagree, we just got to keep talking about it
Yeah.
until we get to a solution that gets us to the vision that you and I can both agree with. Because I think we know when we talk to people who disagree with us generally, you get down far enough, we all want the same things. We just disagree on how. We all
Yeah.
agree on what, we just disagree on how. So you just got to keep talking until your hows match.
That's pretty cool. I want to unpack that vision piece because I think that's really cool. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm honored to be hanging out with Dr. Judy Morely, and she is the owner and founder of You Coaching, and also president and founder of the Gettysburg Cookie Company, which we're going to talk about briefly. But I just appreciate your time here. And it just made me think about the importance of a vision in a company because I hear people like say, we haven't had a chance to get to our vision. It's an option. It always changes. But to your point right there, if a company doesn't have a vision, then there's really nothing. It's always going to be you against me. There's really not that higher, calling, so to speak, where we're looking at the vision of whatever it is, and that becomes our objective rather than our personal goals. And so that's really profound. So for people listening, if you're noticing a high amount of conflict in your office, on your team, in your company, it's possible that there's not a really adherence to the vision. And do you see that a lot, Judy, that when you get into those situations that people lack that vision? Is that a pretty common thing?
Oh yeah, I can't tell you the number of times I have a company that says, "Oh yeah, we did a mission statement. Was that 5 or 6 years ago? And
Yeah,
where
yeah,
is that? Did we
yeah.
whose office is I think it's in a drawer somewhere."
Right.
I
Yeah,
I mean it's so common. And so what that does is it actually creates conflict
sure.
because when a new idea comes up, it may sound like a great idea and it may be a great idea, but does it get you to your vision? Does it
Yeah,
fulfill your purpose? Well, I don't know because we don't know. So then one person thinks it's a good idea, someone else doesn't. Well, what do you measure it against?
yeah. Wow.
And then it just gets down into, well, we're measuring it against everybody's personal opinion.
Sure.
And
Yeah,
if you disagree, there's conflict. Where if you say, well, here's an example. My vision for the Gettysburg Cookie Company, since you mentioned it, is to spread joy through cookies. That's my purpose for being,
You
is
had
to
me at cookies, okay? So you had me at cookies, so that's
yeah, to
awesome.
spread joy through cookies. And there's a part of that where I have another statement about bringing people together to enjoy the sweetness of life.
Sure.
So if someone calls me and asks me to donate cookies for a political fundraiser, that doesn't feel like that's part of my mission.
Right.
But if they call and ask me if I would be willing to donate cookies for a community event where, neighbors are going to come together for the first time to meet one another, that
Sure.
decision's easy. Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. Oh. Well, and I think the opposite of what you talked about, where no one can find the vision statement, is the one that's on the wall, and it's painted on the wall, and it's like two paragraphs and no one could remember what's in it, and oh, we don't even do that anymore. And
Yep.
so there's a real danger there, I think, because people come to work every day, and without a vision, people tend to perish. There's not a lot of direction, and so I think that's a great takeaway here, that if you are experiencing a lot of conflict on your team, it's possible that there is just not a vision for people to get around. It's kind of like I always say, if we had a new golf course and it's just absolutely beautiful, and the only difference is there's no green and there's no hole. But go ahead and tee off, you have no clue where you're headed, right? So you and I would be in conflict from day one, from the first hole, because I'd be going one way, you're going another. Nothing really makes any sense. So I appreciate that you pointed that out. I'm assuming that most people avoid conflict. Is that a safe statement to kind of work off of as we move into another spot?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And you know where I find, here's what most leaders equate conflict with. They equate it with having to hold someone accountable.
Yeah.
Um, it's been my experience. Of course, nobody loves conflict, and so we'll keep our opinions to ourselves or bite our tongue or not rock the boat. That's just common in any team.
Sure.
But for a leader, if you have an employee or a team member that is doing something that they shouldn't be, or they're not performing, or they're expressing uh, ideas that are toxic to the culture, we ignore it as leaders. Leaders
Yeah.
ignore it. Why? That's where the fear of conflict really creates a toxic workplace, because we really probably like this person at some level. We just don't want to make it uncomfortable, and we don't have the tools to do it.
Sure.
But nothing will ruin a culture in an organization faster than watching one person get away with bad behavior that you would never dream of exhibiting.
Yeah. Wow. Well, they always said one bad apple spoils the bunch, right? And I've
Yep.
never seen 100 good apples make a bad apple good, right?
Right.
It doesn't work that way. So the reality is I take it back to the leader. If you have a toxic workplace, I mean, a lot of that's on you. That's just like letting that happen. And now, if again, it's a blind spot that you have and no one's telling you about it, that's a different situation. But generally, I've seen, and I want to get your opinion, don't most leaders know they have a toxic environment? They're just afraid to do something with it.
Yeah, because they're afraid of conflict. They're conflict avoidant. And some of them say that proudly. I've gone
Yeah.
into organizations where the leader will say, oh, I know so and so's a problem and she has been for years, but I'm conflict avoidant. So we just kind of push her over to the side and let her keep doing her
Yeah.
job. I'm
Yeah.
thinking,
Yeah.
meanwhile, you've lost six really good people over this, and you can't
Yep.
figure out why you can't retain employees.
Wow.
You know,
Especially when they say something like, well, that's just Frank. It's like, man, why are you letting Frank, sorry, Frank, whoever you are,
yeah,
why are
right,
you letting Frank do that to the company? And to your point, especially at the expense of six other people. I
right,
mean, somebody's going to leave. Somebody's going to be disappointed. Gallup shows that only 1 in 3 people show up to their job engaged in it right now in
yeah,
the world, and US is no different. So you have 2 out of 3 people that aren't engaged. Now, maybe they're just sitting there in cruise control or on neutral. And then there's some that are actively disengaged that are like really
Right.
doing all the damage that they
Right.
possibly can.
Yeah, they
So
quit and they forgot to tell you.
yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I
And so, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think that that's where I think when we say conflict, I mean, you and I've talked about several levels of conflict: the conflict within ourselves, the conflict within our personal relationships, the conflict within our work relationships. But I
Yeah.
think in the workplace, when we talk about fearing conflict, that is it. It is a leader who won't hold someone accountable and an employee who doesn't have the tools to talk to the leader about a problem in the
Yeah.
culture.
Yep. So I have a question for you just based on that. Let's just say somebody's listening right now and they aren't a leader and they're not in conflict, but they're noticing it as a peer-to-peer type scenario.
Mm-hmm.
What would your word of encouragement or advice be to somebody that, maybe they're in one cubicle over is where the conflict is, and it's not like I'm blaming them, it's really somebody else, and it is kind of affecting the team and it's affecting that person. What do you do as an innocent bystander, so to speak? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, it depends on really how much you care about fixing it, and how much it impacts you directly.
Yeah,
It, I would say this is going to maybe fly in the face of the answer you expect. I would say if it doesn't impact you directly, don't make it worse. Don't
okay.
jump in the middle and don't
Sure.
gossip about it. Don't say
Yeah,
anything about that person. Just ignore.
yeah,
What we focus on expands. And
yeah.
so pushing against something isn't the way to get rid of it. Ignoring it is the way to get rid
Sure.
of it. So
Gotcha.
if it doesn't impact you directly, do that. If it does impact you directly,
Yeah.
I would say to sit down with the leader in charge and influence up. I call it influencing up. We do that by asking questions. We do that by testing assumptions. We do that by painting scenarios and offering alternatives that could work. So, so what does, you know, there's an awful lot of people so Dave, you're my boss, and, you and I work for you, and Frank and I are on the same team. And I'm just curious, Dave, like, there are an awful lot of people that have problems with Frank. And there are times I hear Frank on the phone and he's not even good with customers. So I'm just curious, help me appreciate Frank. What does Frank bring to the table?
Sure.
And if
Oh,
your
wow.
answer is, well, Frank doesn't bring anything to the table, he's just been here 27 years and no one wants to get rid of him,
Yeah.
then you can say something like, well, so how much harm is Frank causing? But you can't do it by telling. You've got to do it by asking. Ask,
Asking. Yeah.
ask, ask.
Yeah. Asking questions is just so powerful rather than making statements, right? That's so helpful.
Yeah,
And I think,
I like to
yep, go
say
ahead.
making statements is parallel monologues. Asking questions is creating dialogue.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And I think that, this might be a blind spot because that person might not think that this is really affecting them.
Mhm.
But then they go home and that's all they talk about at the dinner table. And that's the stress that's the stress they have. They always are talking about Frank and complaining about him. So, it's helpful to help other people kind of help you through this and ask your family, your spouse, significant other, whoever, hey, am I is this do I talk about Frank and I don't even know it, right? Because there's
Yeah,
plenty of people that are like, don't like Frank. And again, sorry, Frank.
yeah,
They,
poor
that,
Frank.
but yet, they don't know it. They don't like him, but they don't know it, and they don't think it's affecting anybody. But it really starts to cause other conflicts outside of that. So, I like dividing that up into is it affecting you or is it not? But sometimes, again, and I think lower EQ people that don't have that social regulation, they don't know that this is affecting them. Other people are affecting them, and quite frankly, they're affecting other people. So,
Right.
uh, but that's awesome. As we start to land the plane today, I wanted to ask, where did you start this? Where did this come alive for you from a personal perspective? Because I'm just curious how this kind of started for you.
Uh, Conflict or transition? or both?
The conflict part.
The conflict part came from being a lifelong people pleaser.
Okay. There you
um,
go. And you just had enough. That's it. I'm done,
well,
right? I'm done with you.
so I was a lifelong people pleaser, and I had worked my way into an executive role in a nonprofit, and this organization was going through a merger, and I was on the leadership team that was creating the new organization, and I sat back and watched how trying to be all things to all people and make everybody happy was killing the merger, because nobody was happy. The more we accommodated, the more people asked for, and the more disgruntled everyone got. And it really hit home with me that by just standing up and saying no, this is not, we're going to merge, but no, we're not keeping the things that did not work. And
Sure.
if you need to have a little ceremony to let those go, or take everyone out to happy hour to say goodbye, fine, but it's not coming into the new organization. um,
Sure.
it was so powerful. And the places where we didn't do that and we dragged stuff from the past into the new organization, this happened in 2012. That organization that I'm no longer with is still dealing with it. And
Hmm.
so it started me thinking about, why are we so afraid to say no? Why are we so afraid? What are we afraid of? And anyway, through that, I started working with other organizations, and then, with my own career life, setting healthy boundaries really is all it is.
Yeah. Huh.
So
So you were, because we love to talk about the transition from corporate America to being an entrepreneur. So you were in corporate America and then you decided to jump in. Was it a long transition? Was it like, that's it, I quit and then I'm starting my new deal? What did that look like for you?
I'm actually kind of a yo-yo entrepreneur. I was in corporate America, and then I became an entrepreneur, and then I went back to school and got my PhD and went into academia, and
Okay.
then I became an entrepreneur and left academia because my life situation changed, and I needed to make this thing called money, which
Yeah.
academia is not really known for.
Right.
So um, so I became an entrepreneur, and then I became a single mother, was raising a daughter, and thought I need steady health insurance. So I went back into corporate America. So I've kind of had that role.
Sure.
Uh,
Sure.
so this last time, I did it the most wisely, where I was in corporate America and then had a side gig the whole time. And then when the side
Okay.
gig got to the point that it
Sure.
could support me, I left.
Okay. Well, and we love to talk about that, and we love to make sure and encourage people listening. There's no right or wrong way because there's a lot of people listening right now around the world that want to own their own business, but they are not sure how to do it. So we always say there's no right or wrong way.
Yep.
We learned a new term today, yo-yo entrepreneur, where you were back and forth. There's nothing wrong with that. There's people that have jumped in and done it, from, hey, this is starting tomorrow. I had a guest on that 7 days after, 6 days after he was married, he quit his job and started his company. Didn't tell his wife, so that obviously was like, yeah,
That was
exactly.
bad.
Yeah, so he's like, yeah, don't do this, So we always love to unpack that piece, and you're a cancer survivor, so congratulations, that's
Thank you.
awesome.
Thank you.
And love to hear that. um as we land again, tell me about your Gettysburg Cookie Company. Fill us in on what that is and how we can get cookies if we have after this show, if we're interested in getting them. How do we do that?
So I live in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and part of the reason I'm here is that there's a lot of leadership coaching and lessons here in Gettysburg. So when I had the coaching business, I came here because a lot of people look to the Battle of Gettysburg to understand leadership lessons without the political baggage of today. It happened 161 years ago. So, let's look at these leadership lessons. So I got here. And I also love Gettysburg, even though I live here and have lived here for almost, yeah, 6.5 years. I'm going to be a perpetual tourist. And
Okay.
Gettysburg's a very small town, 7,500 people, but we get over 1 million tourists a year. And
Wow.
so I call these tourists, myself included, crazy Gettysburg people. And
Okay.
we crazy Gettysburg people know everything about the battle, and we know all the significant locations. And if any of you crazy Gettysburg people out there are listening, drop me an email or something and let's geek out on, should Sickles have moved to the peach orchard on day 2 or whatever. So, about 2 years ago, I got this idea that with all these tourists, nobody's really catering to the tourists. There are bakeries in town where you can get things, but I had this idea that what if we had cookies that were catering to the we crazy Gettysburg people? So I came
Sure.
up with a few significant locations on the battlefield and that played a key role in the actual history of the battle,
Okay.
and came up with recipes around those. So as I think I mentioned to you before we started, I have one called the Peach Orchard, which is dried peaches, pralines, pecans, and white chocolate chips. So
Yeah.
there's a monument on the battle called the Eternal Peace the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. So I have an Eternal Peace Light cookie that's lemon and lavender. Um,
Oh my
so
God.
anyway,
Oh,
so I've done that. So we've been around. We sell through local coffee shops, the museum gift shop, the farmers markets, and online at gettysburgcookieco.com. So
that's where I'm headed.
if
Nice.
there are crazy Gettysburg people out there and you want to see what a Devil's Den cookie tastes like, you
Ah,
can order online.
love it. That's awesome. One more question for you, Judy. I'm gonna let you go. What would your tip of the day be for somebody listening? Maybe it's something that we covered already. Maybe it's something that we didn't that's kind of burning inside of you to get out. But what would your tip of the day be for somebody listening?
My tip of the day would be stop. Just stop and identify what you're feeling right now. Do it throughout the day. Do it every day. You don't have to be mad. You don't have to be happy. You don't have to be anything. You can just be listening to a podcast in the car. Just stop and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Because you'll be amazed at what you learn.
And that's a great EQ trick to do multiple times in a day is just ask yourself, how are you feeling? We don't do that. We rarely check in. We wait until the engine light's on before we do it, or we wait until we have a flat tire. We wait too long. So I love that advice. And thanks for sharing that. People, Judy, that want to learn more about you, that have maybe some conflict questions that we didn't get to. Maybe there's some change or there's some transition that they're in that they really need advice on. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
The best way is through my website at drjudymorely.net, or they can just email me at Dr. Judy, just DRJUDY, no punctuation, at drjudymorely.net, no punctuation.
Perfect.
I mean, except for
Doctor.
the .net.
Yeah. It's Dr. Judy Morely, Morley, and
.net.
again, yeah, .net. So again, make yourself available to that. So two things before after we're done is number one, check in and see how are you doing emotionally right now. And then number two is kind of find one thing that really resonates with you rather than jump into your next podcast or your next activity, is just sit with this for a minute because conflict is all around us. And whether we like it or not, sometimes we get sucked into it, sometimes we don't, but we really can maneuver through this in a positive way, so that it doesn't affect your outcome of your life. You can be a victor rather than a victim. And I'd love to be able to have you connect with Judy if you need that help. Worst case is find out about all the different Gettysburg cookies. It's gettysburgcookieco.com. Is that right?
GettysburgCookieCo.com.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Judy, for hanging out today. This is awesome. My next move is to get some of those peach cookies. I'm going to order those and see how they got to be as good as you're saying, because I'm already hungry. So thank you for all the work you're doing in the conflict world and can't wait to keep learning from you.
Thanks, Dave.